Welcome to episode 59 of the How to Japanese podcast. I'm Daniel Morales from howtojapanese.com, and it's December 2024. We made it. Otsukare-sama deshita. I've got a full plate for you this month. For the newsletter, I combined a few grammar points that I've written about previously and into a kind of new approach to some sentences I'll be breaking down for you. I'll be looking at one very interesting Twitter thread that went viral about Japan. And then I've got some thoughts about the new Murakami translation. No, not that translation, the even newer translation, the J. Rubin translation of Hardball Wonderland and the End of the World. So stick around for that. But first, for the newsletter this month, once again, I'm playing tour guide for the Japanese language. I think this is probably my dream job, tour guide for the Japanese language. Unfortunately, it doesn't pay, but I really just want to kind of show people how Japanese sentences are working. I want to be like, hey, check this sentence out. There's no explicit subject. That's actually kind of a thing with the language. Or another sentence here, take a look at this one. This one has de aru instead of da. That's interesting. Why is that the case? But yeah, no, unfortunately, these aren't paying gigs. But fortunately, I don't have to live off of these gigs and my attempts to play tour guide, just kind of doing it for fun. And this month, I'll take you through 3 paragraphs that I found particularly interesting in an essay that I read. And I say paragraphs, but these are actually paragraphs in Japanese casual writing that we're talking about. So it's essentially 3 sentences and change. If you've ever seen a Japanese blog, you might notice that almost every sentence is a paragraph on its own, and every paragraph is a sentence. This is true for Japanese emails as well. If you're writing an email in Japanese, you probably need to be line breaking early and often, or else you're going to drive the person you're writing to insane. So if you're writing to Tanaka-san, your email should be like this. Tanaka-sama, line break. Osewa ni natte orimasu, line break. Daniel desu, line break. Second line break. O genki deshou ka? Line break. Watashi wa okage-sama de genki desu. Line break. Second line break. I think you get the point, I hope. The double line break often serves as kind of a true paragraph or section marker, and each individual sentence then kind of comprises its own paragraph. Definitely pay attention to the line breaks in the next Japanese email you receive. See how they're using line breaks and how you might be able to emulate that. But for the newsletter, I wrote about 3 paragraphs from an essay in Kakuta Mitsuyo's book titled Shiawase no Nedan, which means the price of happiness. I mentioned her book on the podcast in September this year, so it might be familiar to some of you. I discovered this set of essays at the small Dokusho Cafe, which means reading cafe near my house, and just kind of from the tone of it, I knew I immediately had to have my own copy. It turns out she's a contemporary and relatively prolific writer. A lot of nonfiction works, but also some fiction stuff. It seems like she's been translated a little bit, but not her full range of content is available in English. I found one of her essays available online in UR Press, which is an online journal associated with Urban Renaissance, UR. This is also known as UR Chintai. It's a semi-governmental organization that provides housing in apartment blocks, and they have fewer of the fees that are associated with renting in Japan, such as key money and things like that. But writing for this magazine struck me a little bit as almost writing for airline magazines, except the content in airline magazines is usually pretty vapid, whereas Kakuta's essay isn't just kind of empty schlock. She's got a really nice, delicate touch as a writer, and that's why I chose to use one of her essays for my reading group. I'll put that link online. And she brings this delicate touch to this collection, Shiawase no Nedan, the price of happiness. Each entry is an item that she bought and its price. So to give you some examples, negi soba, onion soba for 390 yen. Suica Kado, the Suica transportation cards, 5,000 yen. Kani Koosu, 5,820 yen. That's a crab course at a restaurant. And so on and so on. Lots of different things that she's bought. And the essays are subtle. These aren't kind of elementary or junior high school essays that have a thesis statement about why a particular item made her happy. She kind of jumps into her thinking, her experience with the thing that she ends up purchasing. She gives the reader not only a full picture of her life and how the item kind of fits into it, but also her thought process and the mental space she creates for each item. For example, in the essay about the crab course, she talks about the difference between people who go out for the purpose of eating and then others like herself who go out for the purpose of drinking. She was always in the latter camp, but she writes about how she kind of made the switch and became able to enjoy a crab course at a restaurant without being frustrated. She also writes what lunch means to her as a freelance writer, how she starts thinking about it at a certain time, how she decides where she wants to eat. She has like a list, a catalog of places that are potential candidates. And as somebody who sits at a desk all day, taking down the minutes before lunch, I can appreciate that. The title of the essay that I wrote about this month is Riso Teki Nakami. Riso Teki Nakami, which means ideal content. She writes about her bad habit of never keeping enough cash on hand, specifically in her wallet, and how that affected a trip to a beach with her boyfriend. Toward the end of the essay, we learned that the ideal content from the title is the amount of money that people should have in their wallets at any given time. She comes up with this rule that a person should always have on hand 1,000 yen for each year they've lived, which for her means 40,000 yen. That seems like a lot, but I think this essay collection was written in the early 2000s or the mid 2000s. So at this point, it's a little bit dated, and I think getting cash is maybe easier, and also there are more non-cash digital payments. So maybe that rule doesn't quite apply anymore. I'd be curious to see if she's written any follow-up to it. But here are the first 3 paragraphs. I'll read them out, and then I'm going to walk through what I noticed about them. I'm not going to translate them at first. I'll walk through what's going on and really focus on what the Japanese is doing. I think sometimes translating into English gets in the way of that. It creates a barrier between the student and the source language. One thing I might recommend, though, is if you're listening to this podcast, you might pause it, find the newsletter, and so that you can read along as I read it out loud while you're listening. I do feel like that would better enable you to kind of dissect the sentences on your own. So go ahead and pause. Give you a couple seconds. Go ahead. Find it yet? Okay. Get it? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and read it out. 私は財布にお金を入れない。いや、入れるのだが、入れる額が非常に少ない。カードをたくさん持っていて、現金を持ち歩かないという主義でもない。ただ、入れ忘れるのだ。2000円、3000円程度しか財布に入れずに歩いていることがしょっちゅうある。そんなに少額で困ることはないのかとお思いでしょう。困ることは多々あるのです。So the reason I picked this passage is that there's really a broad range of topics that this section raises in an incredibly small space. And there are 2 ideas in particular that I've addressed in past newsletters. The first idea is, are we dealing with written Japanese here or spoken Japanese? I might have given away the game already by telling you that this is written Japanese in an essay collection. But let's kind of use that question to look at this piece of writing. Is this written Japanese or is this spoken Japanese? In December 2022, I wrote a newsletter called Kaki Kotoba. That's written Japanese. And I looked specifically at an editorial in the Mainichi Shimbun and tried to kind of pick out the phrases that give the writing the quality of serious written Japanese. What makes it written Japanese? What gives it that quality? And what effect do those choices have? And this is pretty easily defined. The style is called joutai. The jo here comes from joshiki, common sense, and tai from the word karada, joutai. A literal translation might be ordinary style, ordinary form. It's generally translated as direct style. Direct style is characterized by da de aru predicates and by verbs in their dictionary forms or conjugated dictionary forms, essentially not desmas. And we can see here in this writing that Kakuta is indeed using direct style jotai forms. The end of the first sentence is irenai, not iremasen. She ends her second paragraph with ire wasureru no da rather than ire wasureru no desu. But we look at this third paragraph and things start to get a little bit fishy. We see desho and aru no desu. So there appear to be some spoken forms at least. The spoken forms are called keitai. This combines the kei from keigo, so respectful, and the tai from karada. So it would literally mean respectful style. It's generally translated as distal style. And I looked up the word distal for the first time in my life on dictionary.com and found that it means situated away from the point of origin or attachment. And it seems to be some kind of medical term, potentially a dentistry related term. It looks like it's also used as a grammar term for languages with different distinctions of distance between two people talking. So why is Kakuta mixing these two forms here? Why do we see jotai and keitai in the same document? It's a written document. It's an essay. Shouldn't it all be in one form? Let's look at that last paragraph one more time. I'm going to read it out again. 2000円、3000円程度しか財布に入れずに持ち歩いていることが小中ある。そんなに少額で困ることはないのかとお思いでしょう。困ることは多々あるのです。So the first sentence is in written form. She's describing how she often goes out with just 2,000 or 3,000 yen in her wallet. So she's just kind of addressing what she does. That's a very standard writing effect. She's addressing the reader in a sense, but it's a very neutral, not directly at the reader. The reader's reading this writing, but it's just kind of presented out there as a statement. She then switches it to distal form in this second sentence, but she has an embedded question. The embedded question itself is direct style. そんなに少額で困ることはないのか? ないのか? Right there, you can hear that direct style rather than ありませんか or something like that. And then she tags it with the distal style, right? To is a quotative particle that's tagging that question. It's followed by the verb お思いでしょ right? And it's not only a spoken form with でしょ which is the tentative form of des. It's also standard keigo. It's got a polite prefix お, a verb stem 思い, and then でしょ お思いでしょ So it's literally saying, wouldn't you think that? Don't you think that? You might think that. And then the subsequent sentence is a standard distal style statement. So she asks a question in the previous sentence in distal style, and then she answers it. And she uses distal style here because she's addressing the reader. So whereas that first sentence was a kind of neutral declarative statement, very formal, kind of standard jotai writing, we get a little bit of distal distancing because she needs to maintain a more distant presence from the reader when she addresses the reader directly with this question. So because she's talking, having now kind of engaging more directly with the reader, it distances her in terms of politeness, but also creates this kind of spoken forms. She does that by using the spoken forms. And I find that combination super interesting. This is a very conscious decision on her part to create a specific effect with this writing. And I think you can keep an eye out for this in all sorts of writing to see what a writer is doing and how they're having the kind of effect that they have. I noticed it in, for example, a blog post the other day about the new drinkable mayonnaise. Yes, you heard me right. The Lawson convenience store is apparently offering a new drinkable mayonnaise for a limited time. I'm not really tempted by this innovative, I think maybe that's a the nicest word I can say about it, drink. But I am super curious about the reception of it. And so I Googled it and I found a really interesting blog post thanks to Microsoft Edge. Actually, no, I did not Google it. I didn't even Bing it. I found it on the Edge browser, which I wrote about back in April. Edge, if you use their homepage, it has all these recommended websites, and often it's news or blogs or something like that. And you can set your language and region to Japanese in Japan to get blog posts and articles from Japan. I find that it's a really nice way to kind of motivate yourself to check out random Japanese reading opportunities, things that you might not look at otherwise. The article is really interesting. It's a pretty good review, but it starts in distal style, and I'll link it in the blog post for the podcast. It starts in distal style with desmas as the writer goes through the process of opening the package, pouring it into a glass in a very high level of detail. I find that this is a really cool genre of Japanese blog post that I'm really into, where the latest konbini item is broken down in almost microscopic level of detail in terms of package opening, lots of pictures which are very clearly taken on a smartphone, not like a DSLR camera or something like that. But the writing gets really close to the object and is actually pretty fun, I would say. And you might wonder why a blog post like this is using distal style. Desmas is generally considered polite, isn't it? And I talked about above where Kakuta is not only using distal style, but also keiko. That's very clearly polite, but desmas too, neutral polite at least. Yes, but also, on another sense, no. It's more polite than casual spoken language, right? Casual spoken language will share some things with jotai writing, such as there's no desmas. But jotai writing has a more kind of cold, declarative effect compared to desmas in writing, which conversely is more warm and casual. I'm going to read out a little bit of it. And again, see if you can find the link on the blog and read along as I read it out to better decipher it. Here we go. ただ匂いはもう完全にマヨネーズです。市販のボトル、マヨネーズのキャップを開けた時と全く同じ匂いがします。しょっぱさのある卵の香りです。マヨネーズの匂いが嫌いな人はおそらくここでgive up でしょう。Right, so we でしょう、です, things like that, very standard. します. These are very standard distal style forms. But then the writer takes a sip of this mayonnaise, and I like to imagine that this mayonnaise drink was so intense that the only way to express that reaction is in direct style, which it switches to. So listen to this now. マヨネーズ。完全にマヨネーズ。誰だミルクセーキとか予想したやつはマヨネーズじゃないか。Right? So you hear it becomes very casual all of a sudden in very casual spoken forms. Right? They say, who was this? Who was that person who said it was going to be like a milkshake or something? No, it's just mayonnaise. After this reaction, they go through a few more phrases emphasizing exactly the degree to which it is mayonnaise. And then they revert back into distal style. Check this out. マヨネーズ味でも、マヨネーズフルードリンクでもなく、本当にマヨネーズです。液体マヨネーズ。水溶きマヨネーズ。いつも食べているマヨネーズそのままの味が今口に入れた飲み物からしました。甘くないです。しょっぱいです。The des here at the end of the paragraph, I feel, help emphasize what that writer is saying. While they started in distal and then kind of shift to this emphasis with direct, there's this other reversion to distal style, this desmas, that really emphasizes what they're saying. And I think you see that especially with those two simple adjectives in a row. 甘くないです。しょっぱいです。They could very easily have said 甘くない。しょっぱい. But no, they revert back to distal style. 甘くないです。しょっぱいです. So it's worth keeping an eye on what style writers are using and thinking about what they might be trying to do by doing that. To return to the Kakuta Mitsuya writing, I think, in terms of looking at how a writer creates emphasis, there's also one other topic that I've written about previously. In August 2023, I wrote about noda. This is that little bit of language that comes at the end of clauses, at the end of verbs, right? So instead of suru, you would say suru noda, right? In the newsletter, when I wrote about it, I called it one of the most difficult aspects of the language to learn how to use, because I think what it does is almost extralingual. It's clearly lingual because it's right there in the language and it has meaning. But when you translate it, it's so difficult to represent those words exactly. And I don't know if you would want to, in terms of not those words, but noda exactly. That in English, when you translate it, you can almost translate it with an extralingual effect, like something like italics. Kakuta uses it 3 times in the 3 paragraphs that I read, twice in direct style and once in distal style. She says, ireru no daga, ireru no daga. Then later she says, tada ire wasureru no da, tada ire wasureru no da. And then finally she says, komaru koto wa tata aru no desu. Komaru koto wa tata aru no desu. Again, you could easily write these sentences without the noda and still convey the fundamental meaning. So what role is it playing here? In the final 2 examples, it comes at the end of a sentence and really marks the assertion she's making. In the second paragraph, she goes on to explain that she's not one of those people who has a ton of credit cards or payment cards. And so those are all they use, right? She says, カードをたくさん持っていて、現金を持ち歩かないという主義でもない. That's not her. And then she emphasizes that she just forgets. She follows that up by saying, ただ入れ忘れるのだ. I simply forget to put the money into my wallet. The noda here marks that emphasis, and I think it's similar to the final sentence, right? She tells her readers they must think that not having enough cash causes her problems a lot, right? They must be asking themselves, doesn't that cause you a lot of problems? そんなに少額で困ることはないのかとお思いでしょう. And then she emphasizes the answer to that. Yes, indeed, that is the case. 困ることは多々あるのです. Returning to the first example, we can see that it's not at the end of the sentence like another example, but it is around a conjunction, which, while not an end of a sentence, is kind of a pivot point of a sentence. She starts the essay by saying she doesn't keep a lot of money in her wallet. 私は財布にお金を入れない. I don't put money in my wallet. She uses the negative form of 入れる, right? 入れない here. And then she immediately contradicts that 入れない by saying 入れる. And she emphasizes the 入れる to input the money with noda, she says. So essentially she says 入れない. いや、入れるのだが. Do you kind of sense that pivot around the nodaga right there? 入れない. いや、入れるのだが. So it's creating that emphasis around the conjunction, which you can then pivot into qualifying that statement. She says, I don't put money in my wallet. Oh, but wait, I do, but that I do, but is kind of the effect here of the noda. One of my teachers kind of jokingly noted that you should put noda or nodes on the last sentence of any kind of persuasive or argumentative writing. That's generally the location where writers making their main point, and so it's a reasonably good recommendation. But I think that this is a note really to pay attention to how and where it gets used in Japanese writing. It doesn't always get used at the end of sentences, as we've seen. Using it around a conjunction, like Kakuta does here, is a really good example of how you can create this kind of potent hinge, pivot, slingshot effect. 入れるのだが is a pattern that you can use in all sorts of cases. You can imagine saying something like アメリカに生まれたのだが アメリカに生まれたのだが or アメリカに生まれたのですが日本に 日本で育ちました。I was born in America, but I was born in America. That was born is kind of the noda here. I was born in America, but I grew up in Japan. 納豆を食べるのだが、納豆を食べるのだが、I do eat 納豆, but you could say something like, 美味しいから食べてるわけではない。美味しいから食べてるわけではない。I do eat natto, but I don't eat it because it's delicious. Something like that. Although that would be a lie because I do think natto is delicious. So sorry, natto, for slandering you for the purposes of grammatical study for everyone listening. But thank you for your service. You can imagine other sentences where this could be valuable. So keep an eye out for no des and no da. Listen for it. You know, it gets shortened sometimes to nda. In the spoken form, you'll see it in all sorts of written language, and same is true with desmas de da de aru, and where are writers using these two different forms? How are they shifting between them? What effects are they trying to convey by doing so? These are all questions you can start to ask yourself once you identify these particular aspects of the Japanese language. And I think it'll help you create better translations. It'll help you be a better Japanese user, whether you're doing that with the written form or the spoken form. Over on the blog this month, I have a brief follow-up to Kakuta's writing. I used one of her essays for my monthly reading group, and it was from this UR Chintai journal. Thinking about writing for that journal reminded me of a Blue Sky thread that Derek Guy, also known as Dye Workwear, I think that's his username on Blue Sky and Twitter, he had a thread blow up this week about why Tokyo is so stylish. It was a pretty long, interesting look at what makes Tokyo so stylish. He was responding, I think, to somebody who asked why Tokyo is so stylish. And I'm not sure I agree with the entire thing. I honestly do feel like the average Japanese and even the average Tokyoite is about as fashionable as the average American, which is to say that we're all schlubs, basically. But I thought one tweet from the thread was pretty interesting, and I'm going to read that out. Quote, "A big reason why Tokyo is more fashionable has to do with the media environment. There are thousands of hobbyist magazines covering topics ranging from woodworking to whiskey. In menswear, they can get very specific in terms of aesthetic, classic tailoring, workwear, streetwear, outdoorsy style, etc." Unquote. Which that part is very true. If you've ever been in a serious bookstore or even a non-serious like kiosk that sells magazines in the subway, you're going to notice that there's a lot of specialist magazines, a lot of journals that are available on a huge range of topics. Obviously, Derek here is talking about it in terms of fashion, but as he mentions, there's woodworking, whiskey, music, literature, fishing, sports, whatever, you name it. And I think this is also shown by where writers publish. I did a whole podcast series about Murakami's bibliography, and in putting that together, that bibliography, which I only really included all the books that he published, I want to try and go fill it out with all the articles that he did, but there's so many that it would be quite an undertaking, and I'm not sure when I will be able to get to it. But I've seen the one that one of the biggest Murakami harukists on the internet. His name is escaping me at the moment, but wait, is it Osakabe Yoshio? Yes. So he's done a pretty full bibliography for Murakami, and when you see this, you start to understand how someone could make a living off being a writer in Japan, because he published so much and so quickly early in his career that he essentially burned himself out by 1986 and decided to kind of give up all his gigs and just take his one-man novel writing and maybe a few other assignments. I'm pretty sure he was working on that travel book, or at least had that idea in mind as he left And he took all that and went to Greece and Italy for 3 years, where he could stretch his yen pretty far. I wrote about this on the blog this month and how it reminded me that there was a time when short story writers could make a living selling just a handful of stories every year. The best example of this is probably F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was reportedly earning $4,000 for a story by 1929. And that, if you do the calculations on the right website, you can see that it equates to over $73,000 in terms of 2024 purchasing power. And imagine living off of a single short story. I think obviously Fitzgerald's lifestyle was probably more than the current $73,000 worth of income, so you'd probably have to sell a few more, but I could probably live off one short story. It's pretty ridiculous. And obviously Murakami wasn't earning that much, but he was earning. And largely because the Japanese publishing industry has so many publications, it has such an avid reading base. And it's interesting. I do wonder what writers are earning these days and how the scene compares to other countries, what that makes feasible for people. There are a lot of journals out there, and that was one thing that I thought rang true from Derek Guy's Twitter thread. And then finally this month, I wanted to report that I have indeed started reading the J. Rubin translation of Hardball Wonderland and the End of the World. It came out on December 10th, and I started reading it immediately on Kindle because for some reason, the delivery dates for a paper version were stretching into January. For some reason, I was not willing to wait that long. I'm just a few chapters in, so I'm not really ready to give my full thoughts on it. We'll see how much time I have to spend with it over the next month or two, but I really want to at least look at some of the passages I broke down previously for the blog, where I looked at the Birnbaum translation, the original Murakami, and then the edits that Murakami made to the book for the Complete Works edition. And I think it'll be really fascinating to see what version that Rubin is translating based off of. But I will say this, Rubin's translation really nails the first chapter. He captures that kind of frenetic stream of consciousness of the data agent in a way that I wasn't sure how it would hold up to the Birnbaum edition just because I love that version so much. But it does. It's pretty great. He makes a few of the same choices as Birnbaum, such as using the system in the factory for these kind of warring organizations that are fighting over data. But Murakami gives those in katakana, so it's difficult to make choices other than that. Rubin does translate the End of the World section in past tense, which is interesting because he's repeatedly praised Birnbaum's decision to translate it in present tense. The most important decision that I can see right now, that everyone can see, is that Rubin decided to title the new translation End of the World and Hardboiled Wonderland instead of vice versa. And I wondered about this choice. I wondered, would it confuse readers because so many will be already familiar with Hardboiled Wonderland? Would it sound as good? Because I do think Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World has a ring to it that End of the World and Hardboiled Wonderland doesn't. And I also think Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World is appropriate given that the book starts with Hardboiled Wonderland rather than End of the World. Although in Japanese, I do feel like Sekai no Owari to Hardboiled Wonderland sounds better than Hardboiled Wonderland to Sekai no Owari. Although, I wonder, I'd be curious to see what more people think of that. But it does differentiate the two works, which I think there's a benefit to that. You can't look at them and say, and be confused about which one is which. It's immediately apparent which translation is which. I think there's something to be said for that. I've seen a handful of reviews out there. None of them seem that positive just yet, to be honest. A lot of them are noting that it's much longer, but I don't think it's that much longer, to be honest. It will have all the warts that Birnbaum kind of smoothed over a little bit. And it will be interesting to see how that looks. I think I'll probably do a standalone podcast episode for that, so stay tuned. But for now, I would definitely recommend picking up a copy if you can. And that's all I have for this month. I hope you have a blissful end to the year. In Japan, we will have 9 straight days of vacation, which is wonderful. If you get the usual set of days off. Got a haircut yesterday at my barber, and I asked them how many days they'd had off, and I think they said 4 or 5, which that's not bad. That's pretty good too. I'm looking forward to reading and relaxing, and obviously working on a little writing for the January content. So stay tuned and keep an eye out for that. Until then, I hope you're all keeping warm.